It started with a scream, high-pitched, startled, and soaked in disbelief. Not from me or my family, but from a woman balancing a glass of mimosa on a pink flamingo float, while an Angus cow casually nudged her into the murky water of my cattle pond. Moments before, that woman was holding a megaphone and announcing brunch to a crowd of HOA guests who had no idea they were trespassing. Now she was flailing in a mix of cow drool, algae, and mud, desperately trying to keep her sundress above water while my herd began their uninvited swim. And the best part? She still didn't realize I had opened the gate on purpose. The whole mess began 2 days earlier when I noticed unfamiliar cars lined up near the old trail behind my barn. At first, I assumed someone was lost. It's not uncommon for delivery drivers to mistake the gravel path as a public road. But this wasn't FedEx or UPS. It was a parade of luxury sedans and SUVs, and I counted at least 14 of them. I followed the sound of upbeat music, laughter, and splashing around the bend, and what I saw stopped me dead in my boot. My cattle pond had been transformed into a resort scene out of some ridiculous reality show. Giant inflatable animals drifted lazily in the water. A fake tiki bar had been set up on my wooden dock. Even worse, white folding chairs lined the bank, with ladies in sun hats sipping drinks while fanning themselves dramatically. Leading the pack was Karen. She was easy to spot, oversized sunglasses, clipboard in hand, and a voice that could split granite. Karen had self-appointed herself HOA President of the new development across the road, despite the HOA not technically extending to my property. She always carried herself like she ran a country club, and that day she acted as if she had just hosted the Kentucky Derby on my land. As I stood there, flabbergasted, she locked eyes with me and offered a forced smile, the kind you give to a toddler holding scissors near your drape. "Oh hi," she chirped casually as if we were neighbors chatting over a picket fence. "I was wondering if you'd show up. Isn't this weather just divine?" She waved toward the pond, where someone had tied a banner reading Serenity Springs Bridal Brunch. I blinked. My cattle pond, my actual livestock watering hole, was now being used to host a pre-wedding party for some stranger. And she didn't even ask. I took a long breath, trying to process it all. Karen strutted over, heels stabbing into the soft ground, and handed me a laminated pamphlet. It was an itinerary, complete with brunch, paddleboat photo ops, a live harpist, and yoga on the hayfield. My hayfield. She pointed out that they were using the space for just a few hours and that everyone would be gone by sundown. She even said I should be grateful for the exposure, since not everyone gets to host such an elegant affair. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. Instead, I smiled. Because while Karen saw my silence as surrender, I saw it as strategy. I excused myself politely, walked back toward the barn, and called up an old friend of mine who happened to be a wedding planner. She laughed so hard I had to repeat myself twice. But after confirming Karen hadn't pulled any permits or asked for land use permission, she gave me some great advice. Let it play out. Document everything. And when the time comes, let the cows do the talking. For the next day and a half, I watched Karen and her minions prepare for their event with all the precision of a Broadway production. They rolled in portable toilets, set up a makeshift archway near the pond, and hung fairy lights on my trees. At one point, they tried to hang fabric from my grain silo like it was a rustic backdrop. One of the cows stood chewing cud and watching the spectacle unfold with the same look I probably had. Bemused. Confused. Mildly insulted. I noticed they'd placed barriers around the edge of the pasture to keep the cows out. A few were made of plastic, others just string and ribbon. As if my herd wouldn't find a way around that with a strong breeze. The whole setup screamed amateur hour dressed in designer boot. By the time brunch started on Sunday morning, the property looked like a Pinterest board and smelled like hairspray and perfume, two things my cattle aren't particularly fond of. That morning, as Karen began the festivities with a speech about vision, unity, and community spirit, I quietly opened the gate to the pasture. No theatrics. No big announcement. just one simple, slow creak of old metal hinges and the patient waiting game of a man who knows cows have perfect comedic timing. They saw the opening, they smelled the food, and they walked, not ran, down the slope toward the pond like fluffy juggernauts on a mission from God. The first cow to reach the water sniffed at an inflatable peacock before nudging it aside and stepping straight into the pond. Others followed, mooing contentedly. By the time Karen noticed the invasion, it was too late. A guest screamed as a cow sniffed her mimosa. Another tried to rescue her beach bag from a curious steer licking sunscreen off it. Karen flew into a rage, demanding I control my animals. I reminded her, politely and in front of her entire guest list, that this was my land, my pond, my animals, and she, technically, was trespassing. She responded by dialing 911, reporting a cow attack. The dispatcher must have had a good laugh, because the deputy who arrived looked like he was trying very hard not to smirk as he surveyed the situation. Karen argued that the HOA had verbal jurisdiction over any land that impacted community aesthetic. The deputy asked if she had any paperwork. She pulled out her clipboard, only to find it soaking wet, thanks to a splash made by one of the cows now playing with a floatie shaped like a duck. The deputy then turned to me and asked if I wanted to press trespassing charges. I declined. I had other plans for revenge. Bigger ones. Ones that didn't involve court dates or fines, just good old-fashioned country chaos. By the end of the fiasco, guests were fleeing, soaked and muddied, one woman in tears about her ruined sandals. Karen's niece sat on a hay bale crying, mascara running, veil crooked, while a cow chewed on the hem of her sash. The harpist was gone. The yoga instructor was trapped behind a tipped buffet table. And my cows? They were having the time of their lives. As Karen screamed about lawsuits and vengeance, and called me every name in the HOA dictionary, I leaned on the fence, sipping my coffee and smiling. Because sometimes the best way to deal with entitlement isn't through confrontation. It's through cows, chaos, and letting nature handle the RSVP list. And this was just the beginning. Karen had no idea what I had in store next. But she'd soon find out, when she tried to make it official, and I officially made her regret it. It didn't take long before Karen resurfaced. Most people, after being publicly humiliated, voted out, and outmaneuvered in front of their own committee, might take a break, regroup, or maybe try to salvage their reputation. Not Karen. Karen didn't retreat, she retaliated. 3 days after the infamous HOA meeting, I noticed something odd during my morning walk along the fence line. A drone. It was hovering quietly just above the trees, zipping in low circles over my cattle and drifting along the pond's edge. I watched it for a minute, then another, then decided to walk back toward the barn and grab a long-handled shovel. Not to swat it down, I'm not that reckless, but I raised it high enough to make my point. The drone zipped away fast, disappearing toward the HOA homes across the ridge. Later that afternoon, the complaints started. The HOA's inbox was flooded with fresh allegations. According to Karen's new narrative, my cows were creating disruptive, animal-based noise pollution, contributing to ground vibrations that affected nearby homes and emitting dangerous methane clouds that posed a health risk. She even included a highly exaggerated drone video showing one of my bulls relieving himself, with a dramatic caption that read, "Environmental biohazard in progress." I laughed when I saw it, then stopped laughing when a letter showed up from a local nuisance abatement officer requesting an inspection of my property due to multiple anonymous reports. It was thinly veiled HOA pressure disguised in official language. I wasn't rattled. I was prepared. I called my cousin Dallas again and forwarded him everything. He showed up in uniform the next morning, clipboard in hand, and waited patiently for the city inspector to arrive. When the officer stepped onto the property, he was greeted with neatly logged cattle records, water testing results, manure management logs, and a full write-up of my USDA-certified farming practices. Dallas stood by with a knowing grin, casually dropping legal terminology like nutrient containment and federally protected livestock corridors. The inspector nodded, took a few photos, then admitted offhand that it was one of the cleanest setups he'd ever seen. Then he muttered something about wasting a drive and left with a folder full of actual compliance. But Karen didn't stop. Later that week, a neighbor named Tim flagged me down at the feed store and told me that Karen was now going door to door in the HOA development collecting signatures for something she called a cow-free zone initiative. Her argument was that the scent, sounds, and view of livestock were lowering property values and creating an urban aesthetic conflict. She even handed out little pamphlets featuring photoshopped images of cows charging through backyards and stealing pool floaties. The irony didn't escape me. Tim was laughing when he told me this, but he also warned me that Karen was getting desperate and talking about reaching out to local media. That's when it clicked. If Karen wanted a public narrative, then I'd give her one, but not the one she expected. I reached out to my buddy Ethan, a local news anchor who owed me a favor after I helped haul his truck out of a snowbank last winter. I pitched him the story. A small-time farmer whose livestock was being targeted by HOA drama queens for simply existing. Ethan didn't even hesitate. The next morning, a camera crew rolled up my driveway, and we filmed a segment titled Farmer Fights Back. Cows vs. Karens. It was light-hearted but sharp, full of facts, charm, and a touch of mischief. I made sure they included shots of the cows being brushed by local kids, a clip of Dallas explaining USDA regulations, and yes, even the inflatable flamingo floating in the corner of the pond as a not-so-subtle callback. The segment aired that night during prime time and instantly exploded on social media. Comments poured in, praising the cows, roasting the HOA, and calling Karen everything from the fun police to Pondzilla. Karen tried to fire back by claiming the footage was doctored, but no one bought it. Even her own niece posted a TikTok laughing about the whole incident, admitting it was the most chaotic brunch she'd ever attended and low-key deserved it. The story had struck a nerve. People loved a good underdog narrative, especially when cows were involved. Donations poured into the small agricultural charity I'd casually mentioned during the interview, and one local bakery even offered to sponsor a cow-themed appreciation event. That gave me an idea. If Karen was going to turn my pond into the center of a social battleground, then I might as well turn it into a stage of my own choosing. I quickly organized a community event called Moo at the Moon. It was a sunset gathering by the pond with family-friendly games, cow meet and greets, music, and a few local food trucks. I invited everyone, HOA residents included. No fences, no RSVPs, just simple hospitality and hay bales for seat. I hired a band to play country covers, set up lights around the barn, and used the funds from donations to rent bounce houses and paint a sign that read "Cows Welcome." Everyone loved it. Kids hugged calves, teenagers snapped selfies with a cow wearing sunglasses, and even the mayor showed up with his dog. Karen didn't show her face until well after dark, lurking near the edge of the property with folded arms and binoculars. I ignored her, but I made sure the local paper snapped a photo of the crowd right as a banner reading "Respect the Herd" drifted overhead in the breeze. Karen tried once more the following day, this time sending me a certified letter from a legal firm threatening to sue me for creating a public disturbance. Her claim? That my community event had caused increased traffic, disturbed wildlife, and lowered HOA tranquility. I handed the letter straight to Dallas, who forwarded it to the State Agricultural Board along with a summary of events. 2 days later, Karen received her own official letter, not from me, but from the state, informing her that any further harassment or obstruction of an active agricultural site could result in fines and legal action. I didn't see her for a week after that. When she did resurface, she wasn't alone. She brought a man with a camera and microphone, a podcaster known for covering local drama. She must have thought she could spin the story to her advantage. But once I stepped onto the scene and calmly recited the timeline, showed the original video of her trespassing, and played clips from the news coverage, Even the podcaster looked uncomfortable. He asked a few more questions, then turned the camera off and left without finishing the segment. Karen looked like a balloon someone had let the air out of. I thought that might be the end of it, that maybe, finally, she'd run out of steam. But this was Karen we were dealing with. A storm was still brewing, one I hadn't fully anticipated. She was working behind the scenes now, quieter, less public, but far more dangerous. Because while I'd been wrangling cows and press interviews, she'd been scheming with one goal in mind, claiming control of the land next to mine. And if she succeeded, the pond wouldn't just be a battleground. It'd become a hostage. I didn't know it yet, but she was about to make one final move that would change everything. And this time, it wouldn't involve mimosas or pool floats. It would involve land rights, legal loopholes, and a plan so petty it could only have been dreamed up by a woman who once floated on a flamingo in another man's pond. The morning after the pond fiasco, I expected silence, or maybe some apologies, or at the very least, a little embarrassment from the people who had just trespassed on private farmland and thrown a party in a cow watering hole. But I underestimated Karen. Where any normal person would have laid low, reflected, or maybe baked an apology pie, Karen decided to double down. At exactly 9 a.m., a sharply dressed man in a blazer knocked on my front door holding a clipboard. His expression was somewhere between smug and suspicious, like he was about to uncover a vast criminal enterprise instead of standing on a working cattle ranch. He introduced himself as Charles from the HOA Inspection Committee. I blinked. I reminded him that my land was not and had never been part of the HOA. His response was a rehearsed line about adjacent property standards influencing communal aesthetics, followed by a mention of me being under preliminary review. Before I could ask what that even meant, he was already taking photos of my barn, water troughs, and, no joke, my compost heap. I stood there watching him snap a picture of a cow mid-chew as if it were a security breach. When I asked who sent him, he tried to be vague, but a slip of the tongue and a sigh later, the truth spilled. Karen. Apparently, Karen had convinced several members of the HOA that my land, though technically outside their jurisdiction, was an eyesore visible from some of the newer homes on the hill. She claimed my cattle pond was dangerous, unregulated, and unsuitable for livestock. According to her, the cows posed a threat to community well-being. I reminded Charles that the cows had lived here since before the HOA even existed, and he responded by asking if I had a livestock permit for public adjacent property. That was a new one. I didn't know if he was bluffing or if Karen had actually created a fake regulation from thin air. I wasn't about to argue with a guy holding a clipboard, but I wasn't going to let it slide either. I walked him off my land, made a few calls, and by the afternoon, my cousin Dallas, who just happened to work for the USDA, was standing on my porch with a grin. Dallas had dealt with more serious agricultural disputes than a bunch of suburbanites complaining about cows mooing too loud, but he took this personally. We've got a long family history on this land, and the idea of someone trying to regulate our farm from a homeowners association made his blood boil in a way that only family pride could trigger. Dallas inspected everything, asked for all the details, and got so fired up that he printed a sign reading, Certified Agricultural Biosecurity Zone. Entry without permit is a federal violation, and mounted it right on my gate. He even brought an official USDA badge with him the next day just to make it clear that the pond and the cows were not to be tampered with again. Karen didn't take that lightly. That evening, I attended my first HOA meeting out of pure curiosity. I didn't live in their jurisdiction, but since they had come onto my land and disrupted my life, I figured I had a right to sit in and watch. Karen, as expected, was seated at the front, fanning herself with a printed agenda. The moment she spotted me, her smile cracked like a dropped plate. She tried to object to my presence, saying it was a closed session, but one of the other board members, an elderly gentleman named Greg, raised an eyebrow and said, "If you can host brunch on his property, I think he can sit quietly in a chair." The meeting started normally enough. Discussions about tree trimming schedules, noise complaints, and an argument about someone repainting their mailbox the wrong shade of beige. But when Karen moved to introduce new business, adjacent property sanitation and aesthetic compliance, the room tensed. She launched into a dramatic speech about protecting the community from unsightly farmland and harmful animal activities. She described the cows as filthy biological agents, the pond as a festering swamp, and me as an unpredictable landowner with no respect for HOA order. She went so far as to propose that the HOA take legal action to create a buffer zone that would include monitoring and restrictions on my property. That's when I stood up, smiled, and calmly said, "I have a few slides that might help clarify the situation." I pulled out a small projector and connected it to my laptop. The room darkened. Slide 1. A high-definition image of Karen with a mimosa in hand, sitting on a unicorn float in my pond. Laughter echoed across the room. Slide 2. A wide shot of the event setup, complete with a banner that read, "Private Party, No Entry." Slide 3. A screenshot of the property deed, clearly marked outside HOA jurisdiction, time-stamped and notarized. Slide 4. Karen zip-tying a sign to my gate, which read, "Private Event, HOA Authorization Required." The silence in the room was heavy. Greg coughed to cover a chuckle. A woman in the second row muttered, "Oh, wow." I turned off the projector and said, "This is my land. You came onto it without asking, set up a party, and now you're trying to tell me how to run it. I've been here for 20 years. You've been here for 20 months. Let's be clear about who's out of line." Karen stammered, flailed for her notes, and tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. Someone motioned to vote on Karen's proposal. Another person countered with a motion to censure her. Then Greg, with the calm confidence of a man who'd seen decades of HOA drama, proposed the ultimate twist, a vote of no confidence. The room erupted into murmurs. Karen's eyes darted across the crowd, searching for allies. But even the woman who brought the cookies looked away. When the vote was cast, it wasn't even close. Karen was stripped of her acting presidency, and Greg was elected interim chair while they reviewed the HOA bylaws to prevent future cross-boundary jurisdictional overreach. In plain English, they wanted to make sure no one tried to pull what Karen had pulled again. After the meeting, as people filed out, several neighbors came up to me and apologized. One woman brought me a Tupperware of brownies and said, "I didn't know she didn't ask you." I thanked her and said the cows appreciated it. As I got into my truck, I looked back at the community building and saw Karen sitting alone in a chair, staring at the projector screen still showing the image of her on the unicorn float. Back at the ranch, the cows were calm, chewing grass under the stars. I sat on my porch, sipping tea and watching the moon reflect off the pond. I wasn't done with Karen, not yet. She had trespassed, lied, and tried to rally a suburban militia against my way of life. And I had a strong feeling she'd be back. But the next time she tried to cross the line, she'd find a lot more than cows waiting for her. She'd find a rancher who knew every inch of his land, every right under the law, and how to fight back with patience, proof, and just enough chaos to keep it interesting. It started with a for sale sign that popped up overnight on the edge of the property bordering my fence line. It was subtle at first, a small wooden board driven into the ground with a phone number and the logo of a real estate company that specialized in luxury development. At first, I didn't think much of it. That strip of land had been empty for years, mostly brush and a few mesquite. I figured maybe the owner had finally decided to part with it. But then I noticed something off. The sign didn't list acreage. It didn't list zoning type. It listed one thing: scenic waterfront views. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There's only one body of water out here worth viewing, and it wasn't on the land for sale. It was on mine. My cattle pond. I made a few calls and confirmed my suspicion. Karen had reached out to the lot owner weeks earlier, offering above market value in cash. She told him she wanted to preserve community harmony and enhance property value. In reality, she was trying to build a viewing pavilion, an event platform that would let the HOA host gatherings overlooking my pond without ever setting foot on my land. A legal workaround to get the scenery without the consent. I couldn't believe it. She'd lost every battle but was still trying to win the war, one lot purchase at a time. I immediately contacted Mr. Jameson, the current owner of the parcel. I'd done business with him before. He was my main hay supplier for years before retiring. He picked up the phone on the second ring and laughed before I even finished explaining. "Son," he said, "you think I'd sell that patch to Karen after what I saw on the news? I've been waiting for you to call. The place is yours, for $1 and a steak dinner." I nearly dropped the phone. We closed the deal the next morning. I signed the papers, and within 2 hours, my truck was parked where her platform was supposed to go. The land was mine, legally and fully. Whatever plan she had, it was dead in the water. That afternoon, I erected a handmade wooden sign facing the HOA line. It read, "Private property. Cows may approach without warning." It wasn't aggressive, just a reminder. I even painted a smiling cartoon cow on it to soften the message. But Karen saw it as a declaration of war. She responded within 24 hours by building a decorative fence right along the property line, complete with fake ivy, fairy lights, and a sign that read, "Coming soon. Garden Pavilion." She even invited a few neighbors to a preview picnic near the fence line, where she loudly discussed plans for meditation sessions, sunrise yoga, and pond view poetry readings. Now I had no problem with poetry or meditation, but I wasn't going to let her parade around like she'd somehow gained moral victory. So I got creative. A local group of teens I knew ran a weekend paintball club. I offered them a free-range area right behind the new fence, just a few yards back, fully on my property. I had them put up hay bale bunkers, targets shaped like coyotes, and bright-colored flags. Every Saturday and Sunday they came out, blasting biodegradable paint at wooden cutouts, hooting and hollering with joy. The sound of compressed air and joyful yelling echoed across the HOA line, mixing with the occasional moo from a confused spectator. Karen tried to call the sheriff. They came out, looked around, and shrugged. I had all the proper safety signs, everything was zoned correctly, and the paintballs were non-toxic and eco-safe. The only complaint the officer made was about the noise, and even then, it was within legal daytime limits. When Karen demanded I shut it down, I asked her politely, "Would you prefer cowbells again?" She stormed off in a huff, her decorative picnic table abandoned behind her like a shipwreck. A week later, she escalated again. This time, she claimed the cows were aggressive. She filmed them mooing, then edited the clips to make it look like they were charging toward her fence. In reality, they were just curious about the noise and wanted to see what the commotion was. One video even showed a calf tripping over a log, which she captioned as a rampage incident. She submitted the footage to the HOA board and tried to get a formal warning issued against me for maintaining dangerous livestock adjacent to residential zones. Unfortunately for her, the board was done playing her games. Since her removal as acting president, they'd started seeing through her manipulation. Her complaints were filed away with a note that read, "Lack of HOA jurisdiction confirmed. No action to be taken." That didn't stop Karen, though. She switched tactics again. This time, she started parking near the property line, sitting in her SUV for hours at a time with binoculars and a notepad. One of my neighbors sent me a photo of her crouched behind her vehicle, filming a cow scratching its side on a tree. She posted the footage online, claiming it was animal abuse due to neglect. The comments roasted her so hard she had to take the post down within an hour. By now, the neighborhood kids loved coming by the ranch. Their parents trusted me. The cows were gentle, friendly, and a source of fascination for everyone under 12. One evening, a family brought cookies and thanked me for making nature accessible again. That got me thinking. If Karen wanted to claim scenic views, Why not give the whole town a better one? So I hired a muralist and commissioned a giant painting across the side of my barn, facing the HOA homes. It showed a smiling cow, the pond, and a banner that read, "Welcome to Mulandia, population. Awesome." It was whimsical, colorful, and completely infuriated Karen. The final straw came when she tried to install a speaker on her fence playing classical music to soothe the environment. But the moment she did, my cows grew curious, wandered over, and began chewing on the ivy-covered section of her fence. One accidentally knocked over her speaker. Another left a fresh gift on her picnic mat. I wasn't even home when it happened, but by the time I returned, I found Karen in a screaming match with a pair of teenagers who had been tossing hay toward the cows to get them to come closer. She threatened to call animal control, code enforcement, the sheriff, and even the mayor. What she didn't realize is the mayor had already visited my ranch and had a selfie with one of my cows as his profile picture. When she finally made the call, officers came out one last time, took one look around, and told her flat out, "Ma'am, this isn't a neighborhood issue. It's a farm. You're lucky you're even allowed to have that fence standing." That night, as the sun went down and the cows gathered once again by the water, I leaned against the porch rail and watched the light bounce off the pond. The wind carried the faint sound of classical music. Her speaker must have survived, and it oddly blended with the rustling of cattle and the laughter of a few teens still packing up paintball gear. In the distance, Karen stood alone near her fence, watching silently, the flicker of fairy lights casting odd shadows across her narrowed face. It was a strange moment of peace. No shouting, no threats, just her watching and me watching back. I wondered if she finally understood that she couldn't force herself into the space I'd spent years building. That no matter how many fake rules or fences she threw up, this wasn't her domain to control. And maybe, just maybe, she finally realized that every time she tried to dominate with manipulation, all she really did was invite the herd in. Because where there's stubborn pride, cows will follow. And mine? They knew exactly where they belonged. By the time summer edged toward its final stretch, the battles between me and Karen had become something of a local legend. People stopped me in town to ask about the cows, the fence, the paintball games, or the now famous Mulandia mural. Kids brought their parents to take photos by the pond. One even dressed up as a cow for the local costume parade, complete with a cardboard floatie flamingo strapped to their back. As much as I'd tried to keep life normal on the ranch, Karen had inadvertently made my cattle pond a community icon. But what I didn't know was that Karen hadn't given up entirely. She had simply changed her battlefield. She wasn't just fighting me anymore, she was targeting the system itself. And her last move was the most underhanded of them all. It started with whispers. Neighbors telling me that Karen had been attending zoning meetings, pulling property maps, and meeting with county officials. She told them she had a beautification initiative in the works and that she represented concerned HOA homeowners who wanted to reclaim the natural harmony of the area. Her plan, as I would later find out, was to petition the county to declare my cattle pond a shared water feature under a little-known rural environmental clause. Her argument was simple but devious. The pond, though on my property, visually impacted the greater community. Therefore, the community had a vested interest in how it was used, maintained, and accessed. If she succeeded, it could strip my full control and subject the area to joint oversight by the county, or worse, the HOA. When I first heard it, I thought it was a bad joke. But then a notice showed up in my mailbox. A formal hearing was being scheduled to review the zoning status of the water source on my land. They weren't calling it a cattle pond anymore. They were calling it a potential community watershed. I was stunned. For decades, the pond had been nothing more than what it was always meant to be, a watering hole for livestock. But Karen had reframed it as something new, something public adjacent, something she might exploit through a series of carefully worded arguments. I didn't waste a second. I contacted Dallas, of course, who put me in touch with a property rights lawyer specializing in rural land use. The man practically cackled when he read the hearing notice. "This is pure HOA fantasy," he said, but then he frowned. "It's nonsense, but nonsense has traction if no one challenges it." So we got to work. We pulled every deed, every zoning map, every aerial photo going back 30 years. We collected testimony from longtime neighbors, photos of the original barbed wire line, and even old inspection records showing livestock-specific treatment of the water. On the day of the hearing, I wore my best jeans and a clean button-down, and I walked in calm, collected, and with a thick binder tucked under my arm. Karen was already there, dressed like she was attending a garden club gala. She had her hair perfectly curled, a silver pin on her lapel, and a smug expression that said she thought this was a done deal. She stood up when it was her turn, took a deep breath, and launched into the performance of a lifetime. She spoke of visual serenity, shared environmental health, and a neighborhood's right to preserve its aesthetic integrity. She even had a PowerPoint. Slide after slide showed cherry-picked images of cows near the water, paintball kids running past the fence, and zoomed-in shots of pond scum that looked worse than it was. Then it was my turn. I didn't have a slideshow. I didn't need one. I had documents. I had a timeline. I had the law. I explained how the pond had been constructed decades earlier for livestock use. I showed satellite images proving it was fully on my land, and always had been. I read from the state agricultural code about private water usage rights for farms and ranches. I handed over notarized statements from 3 different former owners, all attesting to the pond's function. And finally, I pulled out the letter from the USDA confirming the pond's designation as an agricultural water resource, not subject to shared community regulation. The board members flipped through the papers. One of them whistled under his breath. Another leaned back and looked directly at Karen. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "do you have any documentation that suggests this pond was ever not privately owned or used for anything other than livestock?" Karen opened her mouth, closed it again, and sat down. The vote wasn't even close. The board unanimously ruled that the pond remained private agricultural property with no community oversight. They recommended Karen cease her attempts to reclassify it or face potential legal consequences for abuse of the zoning process. I nodded politely, thanked them, and walked out into the sunlight. Karen didn't follow. She stayed behind, likely stewing in disbelief that all her scheming had once again come to nothing. Her final play had failed. But I wasn't done. I had one last move to make, not for revenge but for closure. I hosted one final event by the pond, this time inviting everyone from the community, the zoning board, and even the mayor. I called it Mufest. There were food trucks, live music, hayrides, and a special float with the cows photo booth, where people could pose in the now famous inflatable flamingo, safely anchored on land. We even had t-shirts printed. Mine read, "Pond Owner Since Forever." Karen didn't show, but plenty of HOA members did. Many of them told me they were tired of the drama and wanted to move on. Some apologized, even if they'd had no part in the whole ordeal. One woman told me her kid used to be afraid of cows, until he started visiting mine. By the end of the night, the sky was filled with string lights, the pond reflected the moon like it always had, and the cows stood lazily by the water, chewing grass and watching the festivities like they were mildly impressed but mostly bored. I leaned on the fence and exhaled. Not because I'd won, not because Karen had lost, but because the land was quiet again. As it should be. As it always had been. Karen moved a few weeks later. Her house went up for sale under the description, "Peaceful neighborhood with pond views," though I noticed the photo cleverly cropped out the fence, the paintball range, and the giant mural of Moolandia. Rumor had it she moved to a gated community on the other side of the county, somewhere with strict rules and no livestock for miles. I wished her well in my mind. Honestly, I did. Because if there's one thing I learned, it's that you can fence in your lawn, paint over signs or build platforms to pretend you own the view, but you can't fake belonging. Not here. Not on land that remembers every boot that stepped on it and every cow that's laid beside its water. As the last of the guests left Mufest and the night grew still, I sat in my rocking chair on the porch, watching the pond. The flamingo float was still out there, a little faded but floating strong. One of the cows gave it a gentle nudge, and it spun lazily in a circle. I smiled. In the end, it wasn't the cows who made the biggest splash. It was the people who stood by them,